We are ready for chapter 17, and this covers the 17th and 18th centuries. We're going to study the, the art movements that came after the Renaissance, particularly Baroque and Rococo. As you see there on your screen, those are the two major art movements that we're looking at today. So you want to pay special attention to how the style of those two art movements or time periods are similar, are different, what characteristics do they have that make them recognizable. That's really what we do as we go through art history, is we really look at how there are similarities in the styles, how there are differences, how one changes into the next. And just to remind you, the previous art movement we just looked at was the Italian Renaissance. We also went up north and looked at the Northern Renaissance that was happening simultaneously. And we discussed the Renaissance in terms of early, high, and then the late Renaissance, which also kind of morphs into a art movement called Mannerism. So we looked at all those things last time, and now we're drifting into the next one, which is Baroque. So let's just get a definition down for Baroque. Actually, first, genre painting. That we'll look at the definition of that, which I think we've covered before, is really kind of just meaning everyday scenes, things of normal life. And then secularism is, just to give you an idea, before we'll get to that definition, but just to give you an idea, is things that are not of a religious content. So the subject matter would not be religious with secularism. Okay, Baroque. Baroque art is full of emotion. Right away, I'm telling you the characteristics. Full of emotion, energy, and movement. Colors are more vivid and contrasting than in Renaissance art. There's a strong presence of light in much of the artwork from this time period. Now you might be thinking, well, the Renaissance art was pretty colorful and had a lot of movement as well. If you think of like the Sistine Chapel ceiling that Michelangelo painted, there's a lot of movement and drama in that as well, lots of emotion. And that is true, but remember, that would be considered the late Renaissance time period. Some of those that we looked at towards the end are drifting towards this direction of going into more of a Baroque style. And the Baroque artists were looking at the Renaissance art. They saw that. And so this is just an extension of that, but you get even more emotion, more energy, and more movement. And then the color is a big thing. While the Renaissance paintings were colorful, you will see that the Baroque paintings are more dramatic, especially with the light sources, and just really rich colors. Baroque art in general favored rich and complex ornamentation. So what does that mean? Like just exquisitely detailed, fancy is a simple way to think of it. Really embellished scenes. So everything just looks very complicated and ornate. It's been called dynamic and theatrical. And each European country developed its own style. So we're going to go through several artists that are considered Baroque artists. Remember, we're focused on Europe in general. We really get a lot from Italy. Italy is just like the central point of a lot of art in these 15th, 16th, 17th century world of art. But it does, all over Europe is being affected by this art movement. All over Europe has its own slightly different style, but you'll see similar characteristics as well. So our first artist there, and do write his name down. His name is Bernini. And he was an Italian sculptor and architect. His Cornaro Chapel combined architecture, painting, and sculpture. So this is kind of an interesting, right off the bat. We're going to look at a lot of painting today, but this one is actually a little different. But it does combine all these, high art forms, architecture, painting, and sculpture, and showing that he was really a master of all three. And he uses lighting to create a theatrical experience in this chapel, in this church. You can think about, as we go through these, I think I'm going to show you 3 Italian Baroque artists. But we get into, there's a French one and some different countries. Why do you think the style between these countries changes so much during this Baroque period? Something to think about. Why would geography affect it so much? So right now we're looking at Italian artists, and this is the work of Bernini. Okay, so what you're seeing there in the first one is the Cornaro Chapel, and this is in Rome, and you can see there, look up above at the top, you'll see all kinds of painting, exquisite detail, very elaborate, ornate, as they said. And then you look down a little bit and you see at the altar there, you have like this central focal point here, which is the um, sculpture itself that you see over here, which is entitled Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. And again, this is just like Bernini doing all these things together. He has sculpture, architecture, and painting. If you're wondering, Teresa, this woman in the center sculpture, was a Spanish mystic, founder of a strict order of nuns, and an important figure in the Counter-Reformation. She claimed to be the subject for many years to religious trances in which she saw visions of heaven and hell and was visited by angels. It is in the throes of such a vision that Bernini has portrayed her. So what's interesting here in regard to history is you had the church as the central, the Roman Catholic Church as the central unifying thing throughout Europe, right? The Romans had spread, and then the Catholic Church had spread throughout that empire, and so really that religion unified everything. Well, then you have Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation happening just prior to this, what we're talking about now in the Baroque art period. And so when that happened, there was actually a conscious effort for the Catholic Church to commission artists and use artists to make paintings, make sculptures, make these artworks that would reinstill their faith in the Catholic Church. We call this the Counter-Reformation. It's going against the Protestant Reformation efforts at that time. So a lot of these works that you're seeing are based, they're almost all very religious in tone, very spiritual, biblical themes. And then a lot of it is sort of trying to draw people back in or keep them in the Catholic faith. And so you have a lot of people at this time that are uneducated, illiterate, And so imagery is very important in communicating the message and the power of the church. So just be aware of that as we work through these artists as well. So our next artist is also Italian, Gentileschi, and she is actually a woman, which is kind of cool. And she was a painter. This painting we're going to look at is titled Judith and Maidservant with the Head of Holofernes. It combines dramatic lighting with rich primary colors to enhance the visual experience. So you can get a little bit of detail about that painting down. Let me just give you a little background on this one as I click to it so you can understand what you're seeing here. Let's see if I can make it. Oops. A little bigger. Okay. So what we have here is the artist took her subject from the biblical story of Judith. According to the scriptures, Judith, a pious, beautiful Israelite widow, volunteered to rescue her people from the invading armies of the Assyrian general Holofernes. Judith charmed the general, accepting his invitation to a banquet, waited until he drank himself into a stupor, then calmly beheaded him, wrapped his head up in a sack, and escaped. So she actually made other paintings showing the decapitation in progress, but here she focuses on the moments after the gory deed is done. And you see there at the bottom, as scary as it looks, the head of this general. She poses Judith tensely caught in the wavering light from a single candle, one hand still clutching the bloody sword, the other posed in a gesture of silence. So that gives you a little background as what we're looking at there. Now, right away, this is our first painting we're looking at that's truly Baroque in style. Some common characteristics. Even though this is a Hebrew woman, or an Israelite woman, this is kind of usually thought of as a simple, clothing would be very simple for the Israelites. What I'm getting at is maybe the way this has been portrayed is pushed to be in this Baroque style. And so even though these women are just simple, probably not fancy at all Israelite women, they are almost portrayed in a way that makes them appear very aristocratic almost. Do you see that? Like the rich colors of their clothing. You see some ornate detail even on her head. There's some sort of thing. I don't know. We don't know what these things are. They're not really fancy in themselves, but yet the way it's drawn and painted, it feels almost has a royal, king-like, king and queen type essence to it. So that's just the Baroque way, is to illustrate things in this very rich way. And so another really strong characteristic of Baroque art is this dramatic dark and light contrast. Can you see that? Remember, contrast is creating that difference between, it could be between a cool color and a warm color, or between darks and lights. It could be smooth shapes next to rough shapes. Anything that is opposing creates that contrast. Or opposites, I should say. So notice the extremely theatrical dark essence behind, and then that light putting out the bold shining on the women. If that's the only light source, it feels like that is a little heavy for that one little candle. But that's the Baroque way, is to exaggerate things like that. Okay, so that's our example for Gentileschi. And then the next artist is Caravaggio, and this is also an Italian painter. He influenced many other Baroque artists with his use of dramatic lighting. In fact, Caravaggio influenced Gentileschi that we just looked at. So Entombment of the Christ is one example of his technique. Perspective was used to control the eye level of the viewer. So let's take a look at this one. And as you can see, we are right at the eye level of this stone platform here. Do you see that? This was 1604. Let's click back real fast and look at the date of Gentileschi. 1625, 1604. So 20 years before Gentileschi. And again, her style was very much influenced by Caravaggio. So what I was saying was our eye level, while we're looking into the scene, is right here. So it's very much like a stage feel. Both of these paintings I've shown you are like a stage feel, like you're watching theater on a stage. And so our eye levels here, we're almost looking up at this scene. Just the dramatic placing of where people are, the struggling looking posture and effort. You feel people like, you feel the weight of what they're doing, like the weight on his feet, holding the weight of Jesus as they're putting him into the tomb. Just the drama of it all, right? You feel that as you look at it. The figures aren't just staring into space, they're all looking different directions. You get the essence of a lot of emotion on their faces and their body postures. Oftentimes a lot of diagonals are used. In this case, it's almost like see if you can follow my line here. Remember we talked about implied line? Obviously there's not just a straight line, but there is an implied line that kind of starts here at the cloth, moves up the Christ, up the angle of his leg to this bright spot on his elbow perhaps, and then up to this woman with her hands raised. So there's very much a strong diagonal. And what is making that diagonal is light, where the artist chooses to shine the light all through this area. It kind of pulls our eye through the diagonal. And remember, when we learned about lines, diagonals create tension, motion, and so all those things are definitely intentional by this artist. And then up here in this whole top corner, you have darkness. Down here in general, you have darkness other than his feet. I'm going to share something about this painting that's going to ruin it for you, because I always look at this and the way he lined up his legs with this woman makes it look like those are her legs. And it just throws me every time because it looks like she's too short and her legs are huge. It's not her legs, it's his legs, which looks very much in proportion. But I have always looked at that painting that way, and it makes me not like it. But nonetheless, very important and great example of Baroque art. Whoops, sorry, I slipped out of. Okay, a couple of other artists now. These are not Italian. We're leaving Italy. Still the Baroque period. We have Peter Paul Rubens, a Flemish painter, and Nicolas Poussin, a French painter. So Rubens, a Flemish painter, the raising of the cross is typically Baroque in its use of an S curve for Christ's body and the overall sense of movement. So I'm going to show you Peter Paul Rubens' painting, and then we'll go back to Poussin. So here it is. Do you see the 3 panels? It is a triptych like we learned about earlier. This is a very large triptych that would have been at the front of a church. The church burned, and so we don't have the original frame, and we don't have the church, but it has been placed in a different place, a different church. And this is, I'll show you just I'm gonna enlarge this one to show you what it looks like. Maybe. Slide this over. There we go. So you can see here, this is the actual painting in its location now. And it's not at the front of a church, it's kind of like over to the side. You can see it's roped off, kind of like almost like an art piece. But it's very big. Look at the woman in the picture compared to it in size. And again, it wouldn't have been on this, or this is not the original thing or even the original frame, but you can see how it's almost like these are, well, they are on hinges. And so these fold in, and there would be a painting on the back of the closed version of it. But when you open it, that's where the grandeur of the main painting and scene is on the inside. And so let me shrink this one back down and show you me up close again, the clearer version. So we see lots of Baroque characteristics here. Dramatic, right? Dramatic movement, motion, struggle. Look at the men struggling to lift Christ on the cross. Over here, lots of drama, upset women looking on. Over here we have Roman soldiers with some more criminals being led to the cross. So there's just lots going on. It's like looking into a scene, isn't it? A very dramatic production. And then it mentioned in our notes that Christ sort of has this S-curve shape. And then this very strong diagonal that you see. Using the light skin of Jesus to bring our eyes to that, really. We still have a lot of contrast. We have that dramatic light and dark. Maybe not as much as some of the ones we just looked at, not as much as Caravaggio. And so there's one difference. How is this different? Let's just look. How is this one different than Caravaggio's? What are some differences that you see there? And by the way, these are painted only within 6 years of each other. They're not that far apart, but we see some pretty dramatic difference between the styles of an Italian painter and a Flemish painter. And by the way, Flemish means modern day Belgium will be there where that is. But those northern countries, they all sort of had a similar style to them. So this is Italian Baroque, and this is Flemish Baroque. Some would say that the Italian style, and I show you Caravaggio, but many Italian artists had this very similar look to their artwork. Some would say these actors on the stage almost feel frozen in time, like they're not really moving. Yes, they're in the act of emotion, but it also feels very still in a lot of ways. Where this one feels like there's movement currently happening. What creates that feeling? They still, both of them have kind of these dramatic body poses, but somehow Rubens creates more movement in his, like you can almost see it starting to move. You almost feel that there is motion happening. Now, Rubens was in Antwerp, which, as I said, is modern day Belgium, but he traveled to Italy and he studied Caravaggio, who was so well known for his style. So he did learn from him some of the things like the dramatic diagonals, theatrical feel. All of those things can be recognized, but there's still some differences. Another difference perhaps is this addition to a landscape in the background. Not that there aren't Italian examples of landscapes in the background, but both of these that I showed you have a very simplified, very blacked out background, where this one has a lot of color and detail going on. This one's darker on this panel, but it is a difference. And our second artist, Poussin, is a French painter. His work, The Ashes of Faucon, represent the French more restrained and classical style of Baroque. So this is very interesting because I think you're going to see a dramatic difference when we look at this French style. So first of all, subject matter. What are we looking at here? Phocnon was a famous Athenian general in the 4th century BCE. In his old age, he was unjustly accused of treason, tried, and sentenced to death. The cremation or burial of his remains was outlawed. His friends and supporters dared not defy the court to accord him an honorable funeral. Only his widow did not desert him, arranging for cremation and performing the rites herself. She is shown here gathering up her husband's ashes outside the city walls. Her virtuous act was much admired by the ancient Roman Stoic philosophers who taught that virtue was the only good vice, the only evil, and that the triumphs of suffering of life were to be accepted calmly and without passion. So, this is not a religious scene, is it? It's the story of a general, an Athenian general. So we're talking classical period, and the architecture you see in the background, you see the very Roman classical looking design of that building in the background. And it's just not a religious context at all. So that's one big difference. Almost all Baroque art is focused on religion, especially in Italy and places that were the church was using, artists were being used to help promote the church. So obviously in France, or at least in this artist's work, that's not the case. Each country just really developed its own way. Excuse me. And France just really retained this classical version. You have more the Renaissance style almost retained. However, it does have a little more theatrical essence than the Renaissance style would. It's different. It's not exactly the same as what Renaissance style is, but yet it's certainly not the same as Caravaggio or Gentileschi, some of those other artists we've looked at. Also, what's another difference? Another difference would be Rubens, the Flemish painter, is pretty zoomed in, right? Pretty focused on the people. The people even get cropped off the edge of the canvas a little bit. So it's really zooming in, taking like a snapshot of a scene. But we do have some landscape back here, as we talked about. Caravaggio's is even more zoomed in on just a specific group of people with this thing going on, and Gentileschi is very zoomed in on just a couple of people. And then this one, she's the maidservant. It's cropped off the side. In Poussin's painting, I think you can see a very different thing going on here. Its focus is the landscape, which most of Poussin's paintings are this way. They're very landscape based with something going on, a scene involving people, but it's not the zoomed in focused part of it. You see the entire scene and setup as well. So we have a very big landscape. Yes, dramatic darks and lights, but maybe not as much as just those almost stage-like feeling paintings. All right, the next one we're going to look at is a Spanish painter, Velázquez, which is a very famous guy. All of these are, but Velázquez is very well known and liked by a lot of people. A Spanish court painter, his masterpiece, Las Menas, used light to create drama and emphasis and help organize a complex composition. Okay, so here is the one on this one here on the left. You can see is Velázquez. In English, that would be the Maids of Honor. I guess it would be pronounced Las Meninas. So as a court painter, he created his masterpiece here. At the left, we see the artist working on a very large canvas. Do you see that? This is actually the artist here working on a very large canvas, huge canvas. Well, we can only guess at the subject he is painting. Perhaps it's the young princess who stands regally at the center, surrounded by her attendants. One who is a dwarf. Or perhaps Velázquez is actually painting the king and queen who we see reflected in a mirror on the far wall. So here, if you'll look back here, there's a mirror and we see a king and queen reflected. And so perhaps he's painting them and we can't see them. They're like out here with us, which would be a good conclusion to draw since he's looking straight at us, right? Their participation is clear, but where are they standing? Possibly they are outside the picture, standing next to us as observers. The ambiguity is part of the picture's fascination, as is the dual nature of the scene. Although it shows a formal occasion, the painting is an official portrait. Velázquez has given the scene a warm, everyday quality. So not your typical formal portrait, right? It just kind of feels like action, like things are going on. So there's that Baroque feel, like it's a scene. We're looking into a scene of something going on. And interestingly, again, remember, Velázquez was a court painter for the King of Spain. And so it was what the king wanted to be painted was what he did. So these two do not represent Christian themes at all. Again, like the typical theme of Baroque painting. This over here is considered one of Velázquez's most famous paintings, and it is entitled The Feast of Bacchus. Bacchus was the Roman god of wine, and so he is actually kind of drinking and celebrating with these poor people. So it represented a sort of more social meaning context of how the locals and the lowlifes could come and drink with this Roman god, which is kind of a strange theme, but it actually was done multiple times through our history. And this painting was commissioned for the king, and he actually had it in his bedroom, I think, as like or his summer home or something, summer bedroom of his home, where it was like just almost like more maybe of a fun painting, or not your typical subject matter for a king, but is considered to be one of his most famous paintings. And as you can see, it still does have that Baroque style of theatrical. This Roman god is kind of illuminated and lighter, like almost like the Jesus figure in some of the other paintings we've looked at, like the Raising of the Cross has some similarities of that. So anyway, this is just another example of non-religious themes. So we would call this secular. Actually, no, we would not call that secular because it's about a Roman god, but this would be secular in meaning, subject matter. But a couple of examples from Spain of Velázquez. And then we have Rembrandt, a Dutch painter. So another country, his work, The Night Watch, represents the Dutch interest in social organizations and community and less on the church again. So I'm seeing a theme here, I don't know if you are, that as we get further away from Italy in some of these outlying countries, we have less of that religious context. His innovation was to paint individual portraits within the context of a larger activity. See if you see that happening when I show you the painting. And this is where we can talk about genre painting, painting that focuses on scenes of everyday life. When we looked at Northern Renaissance painting, we looked at the February by the Limburg brothers, and it was a calendar painting of that scene of the women inside warming while the men were outside working in the snow. And that definitely was a genre painting where it just shows everyday life. Okay, so I'll go ahead and show you this painting by Rembrandt van Rijn. It has a kind of long title there, as you can see. We typically just call it The Night Watch. This painting has an interesting story behind it. We definitely see, just first observing it, how we can see the lighting effects that Rembrandt has used, that he maybe saw by Caravaggio and some of those Italian artists. The painting portrays a kind of private elite militia. Such groups had played a prominent role in defending the city during recent wars against Spanish domination, and although by Rembrandt's time their function was largely ceremonial, they were still widely respected, and all the most important men of the town belonged to one, this sort of elite militia. Dutch civic organizations often commissioned group portraits, and painters usually responded by portraying the members seated around a table or lined up for a 17th century equivalent of a class photograph, like lining up everybody. Rembrandt's innovation, however, was to paint individual portraits within the context of a larger activity, a call to arms. He groups the figures naturally in deep space. So take a look at these things as I describe it. With Captain Cock, it's resplendent in a red sash at the center. The composition builds on a series of broad V shapes pointing upward and outward. So you have these gentlemen in the middle. You have this red sash, which is kind of eye-catching and brings your attention to it at the center. And then you have a variety of V shapes pointing upward and outward, such as these sticks here, even this man's arm, which then goes up into this flag, goes out. The guns kind of point upward and outward, the different things that they're holding. So there's a lot of line usage there. Rembrandt has sculpted it into greater naturalness through the dramatic lighting of the scene. Light picks out certain individuals. Captain Cock, this guy. Himself, the drummer at the far right, this guy. The lieutenant at Cock's side, awaiting orders, and especially the little girl in a golden dress. Actually, this, I guess, would be Captain Cock, and this would be the lieutenant. So the little girl in the golden dress definitely catches our attention and has always remained a mystery. No one really knows what she is or who she is. For many years, Rembrandt's painting was known as The Night Watch and is still informally called by that name. The reason has nothing to do with the artist's intent. A heavy layer of varnish on top of the oil paint, combined with smoke from a nearby fireplace, had gradually darkened the picture's surface. So it was really, really dark, and everybody just thought it was a night scene until and no one alive could remember it any differently. It was only when the work was cleaned in the mid-20th century that the light-filled painting we know today reemerged. Even now, though some members of the group can be seen more clearly than others, and viewers have often wondered how that could have been acceptable to the militia. Documents have revealed that each member contributed to the commission according to how prominently he would appear in the finished painting, and history records no complaints about the results. So as you see, some people are kind of blend in, and some people, like he's kind of in the shadows a bit, where this guy is pretty boldly in the light, and these two really are pretty in the light, and this guy's pretty in the light. So there's documentation that they paid more money to have themselves more prominently displayed and more light put on them. Still very Baroque in style, still has a lot of those same characteristics, almost a theatrical scene, dark background, some motion and movement. Not a lot going on in this scene as far as like extreme drama, but yet we feel a lot of motion and movement and even some tension in the poses of the people. So again, typical of Baroque style. Also not a religious scene. I'm just making note of that because, again, we're looking at a variety across all of Europe, but the majority of Baroque paintings were religious in tone. So we're going to look at a piece of architecture now, and this is called the Palace of Versailles at Versailles. It was redesigned and enlarged by King Louis XIV. The exterior of the palace reflects the classical tendencies of French Baroque. Remember, there is still that classical touch that we see in Baroque. And in that French painting by Poussin, we really saw that classical stronger than in the Italian paintings. But the exterior of this building is going to look very classical, very Greek. The interior reflects the rich ornamentation of fully Baroque architecture. So let's take a look at this palace. This is an example of Baroque architecture. Here's the outside of the building. You can see very, very classical looking. Versailles occupies about 200 acres and more than 1/4 of a mile wide. It includes extensive formal gardens and several grand chateaus. And then inside, you see this incredibly ornate, decorative, just lavish gold and detailed sculpture in its example of Baroque interior space. This particular part that you're looking at with the chandeliers and the light is called the Hall of Mirrors, 240 feet long and lined with large reflective glass mirrors. I'm going to play a video that will show several of the things we've already looked at, several more examples showing especially how the themes and subject matter was almost always Christian, as the church was really doing a campaign to reestablish itself despite the Protestant Reformation.
Period in art has a rather fascinating beginning. During the mid-1500s, the Catholic Church was feeling threatened by the increasing conversion of the population to Lutheranism. The Church convened the Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563. At the Council of Trent, religious reforms were being questioned, proposed, and reconsidered. Martin Luther's scathing criticism of the Church found supporters everywhere. As a response, the Church launched an advertising blitz, reiterating and reaffirming its fundamental teachings to combat the Protestant criticisms that were turning the public away from the Catholic Church. Since winning over the few educated intellectuals who were able to read at the time would not make a big difference in maintaining the power of the Catholic Church, the uneducated masses were targeted. Since the majority of people could not be reached via the written word, to inspire them to stay loyal, the Catholic Church and its teachings would require a medium that did not require literacy. The answer to this was clear. The Church embarked on a systematic religious advertising campaign using art. This marked the beginning of the Baroque era. In the 1600s, the Baroque style became prevalent among artists in Rome and Italy, and Baroque works filled with religious grandeur spread to other parts of Europe until the 1750s. Artists were now being actively encouraged to express their faith through grand and beautiful artworks. Baroque art celebrated intense personal visions, conversions, religious visions, death, and even martyrdom. The images Baroque artists created were realistic, intense, and extravagant. Vivid use of color was becoming a more dramatic feature, and the different elements and figures of a composition could be overlapped, instead of being isolated in the center of the work. In its early years, the term Baroque was actually derogatory. To call something Baroque meant that it was considered overly exaggerated and filled with unflattering details like warts and wrinkles. This offended viewers and critics who were used to the painstaking realism of the Renaissance. Baroque paintings show a wide range of styles and artistic influences. They are dramatic and offer rich details, beautiful deep shades of color, and honest realism. Baroque artists typically painted pictures that captured the ultimate dramatic moments that showed unfolding events taking place in real time. You were no longer left to imagine what took place during a battle. These scenes were being depicted in excruciatingly realistic detail. In fact, you might even think of many Baroque paintings as theatrical snapshots that were shown from the perception of each individual artist. A number of artists were able to establish their reputations during the Baroque years. Among these are famous names such as Rembrandt, Rubens, Poussin, Caravaggio, Vermeer, and Velasquez. Rembrandt was a true master of Baroque art techniques. You can observe his exceptional use of light and shadows in Philosopher and Meditation, or Descent from the Cross. Today, his brilliant brushstrokes and keen eye can be seen when looking at any of the masterpieces that he created during the 17th century. Poussin's religious paintings were didactic in nature. They were meant to teach moral lessons to students and persuade them of the importance of biblical and classic mythological events. The Adoration of the Magi, depicting the three kings bearing gifts to the baby Messiah, and the Adoration of the Golden Calf, illustrating a celebration of worshippers dancing around a false idol, were two of Poussin's best-known biblical paintings, meant to help viewers contemplate lessons of Christian righteousness and sin. Poussin's work is noted for its vivid backgrounds, which include both natural landscapes and mathematically precise architecture. He is also credited with developing the theory of modes, which advises artists to use forms and methodologies specific to the work at hand. Caravaggio's Crucifixion of St. Peter is a classic example of how Baroque artists use the medium of art to skillfully tell an entire story. They evoked a spiritual response and reinstated faith in one fell swoop, without making any of this overtly evident. The piece depicts the scene where St. Peter, impaled on the crucifix, is being lifted by three Romans after his request to be positioned upside down. The eloquent body language depicted in each of the figures in this masterpiece speaks volumes about the artist's skill. The strain of lifting Peter is very evident in the stance of the three men, showing that the sheer magnitude of their crime is weighing them down. St. Peter's face is bathed in divine light, glorifying him without impinging on the drama and emotion of the scene. One thing is very clear when you look at the artwork created by these Baroque masters. Their objective was to evoke the spirituality within, to encourage the viewer to connect with the scene that was depicted, and to cement belief in God's compassion for mankind. They sought to create a scene that was larger than life, spiritual, and capable of evoking a sense of awe. All of it was done with one goal: to communicate in a grandiose, glamorous manner a strong religious message to the masses. The Rococo movement, also known as Late Baroque, gradually gained momentum, and in the 1700s, this movement replaced the Baroque period. Rococo art preserved many aspects of Baroque technique, but opted for less political themes, softer and brighter colors, and a more light-hearted tone. Although the apex of the Baroque art period is now reconciled to the pages of history books, it is important to remember that these ideas and techniques continue to exert power and influence in the art of our modern world.
So after Baroque comes the Rococo period, which is really, as in the video said, an extension of Baroque. It has a lot of the same characteristics. It has similarities in a lot of ways, except definitely not in subject matter. So the Baroque period was longer. The Rococo begins, as this says, in the first half to 3/4 of the 18th century. And 50, 70 years approximately. You know, they blend from one to the next, so there's not always just a real definite beginning and end. Sometimes there is, but in some cases it just sort of blends from one to the next. But it wasn't a development and extension of the Baroque style. Rococo actually means rocks and shells because of its such ornate detail and decoration is part of that. So when you look at interior spaces and architecture, you can see lots of frilly, lacy, decorative things with little shells and intricate things, just very happy, like trees growing and viney type effect. And so it's got a lot of nature in it, but it's also very much just ornate and happy. A little more about Rococo. Like the Baroque, Rococo is an aristocratic ornate style. So only at this time, the aristocracy in France is extremely elevated and dominant, where you have a huge chasm between the rich and the poor, and then you have this massive amount of poor peasant people in France. And so this is leading up to the French Revolution. This shows, as art does, like a parallel between history as we learn it about revolutions and wars. Art is really a way that documents what's happening at that time period. So this is kind of interesting. It shows just how embellished and elevated the aristocracy was in France at this time. Now, Rococo is not just in France. That's just kind of like the headquarters of it. It's kind of where it originated from, but it is something that would be throughout Europe. So secularism, oh, I didn't read the rest of this. Pastel colors and light-hearted secular subjects that are smaller in scale represent this period, where Baroque paintings are often huge. These are smaller paintings in scale. But also, this is a big thing if you want to make sure you get an understanding. It's the colors are lighter, happier, pastel, and the subject matter is secular. It's not religious anymore. So there's a definition of secularism in art, non-religious or the exclusion of religious subject matter in a work of art. And so you'll see that. It's just happy little scenes focusing on living life and enjoying life when you're rich, basically. And so we also can look at architecture. We'll look at an example of that first. Rococo style of architecture is sophisticated. It originated in France, but was soon exported to other European countries. And really that example of the Palace of Versailles, though that is Baroque, that shows that connection to this style of architecture that we're going to look at. So here's the first example, and you don't have to copy down the name of this one. It's not going to be tested. It's just to show a really good example of that Rococo style. Notice this is in Germany, so that although it originated in France, this is an example of how it is spread throughout Europe. The white marble is a common thing. with Rococo style architecture. You'll see the white contrasted with the gold and ornate designs and paintings on the ceiling, and just this, let me go in here, this type of almost like viney floral decorative stuff. This is very Rococo-ish, but you have these columns that are white and then this real ornate thing here. That's all. This is just very Rococo. I think of it as over the top, just like frilly, ruffly, beautiful. It's beautiful, but it's just over the top in style. And that's architecture. Let me show you now paintings, which are pretty easy to recognize when you see a Rococo painting, or architecture for that matter. And this guy Fragonard is one of our best examples of the style. He was a French painter who expresses through his work the dreamlike aristocratic qualities that appealed to the wealthy during the 18th century. And do you think these paintings and architecture that the poor would see, perhaps from the outside, made them feel any better? You have this peasant, low class, just starving people that are getting angrier and angrier. And this is what the wealthy are living in. So you can see how that led to the French Revolution. Here is Jean-Henri Fragonard, The Pursuit. I guess it's en noir. 1771, so we're 3/4 through the 18th century when this was painted. And this is from a series of paintings about this pursuit. This boy pursuing the lovely maiden in her frilly, ruffly dress. And this is just very typical style of the ruffles and the lace and the flowers and just overflowing with joy and love and beautiful things. So that is, and just showing the aristocratic lifestyle at that time. It does have characteristics of Baroque. You can probably recognize it feels theatrical. It feels some contrast in color. We have dramatic lights where the light sunshine is shining on things and shadows. So it does look a little bit like Baroque, but subject matter, certainly not. It's much more lighthearted, just young love, where the other, different than the Entombment of Christ or something like that. So you can definitely see a contrast there in subject matter. Okay, so that was just to give you an idea of what Rococo looks like. And now comes the Revolution. So the French are tired of this aristocratic society. And so the end of the 18th century in Europe is characterized by the French Revolution. Neoclassicism became the official style of this revolution. Jacques-Louis David was its official artist. They actually had like an official revolution artist, and that was him, David. And you see him a lot. You see a lot of his artworks from this time period. This was not just neoclassicism did not just stay in France or even just Europe. It spread even to the United States. So John Singleton Copley would be a famous painter in America that had some of the same revolutionary ideas. And he painted this famous portrait of Paul Revere, which I believe the video will show you, who was also a revolutionary, an American revolutionist, right? The British are coming. This video will show several examples and give you a background on neoclassicism. Remember, neo means new. And so this is 18th century artists looking back to 18th century and even 19th century artists looking back to the classic style, the Greco-Roman, so Greek and Roman style. Many excavations were being made at this time, and many artists were kind of just inspired by the clean lines and the idealized figures and perfect looking people of this of the classic period. So it's just a shift from the frilly, ruffly drama. It shifts back to a more stoic, serious tone. And you'll see that happening in neoclassicism. So we'll talk about some of the other characteristics we see as we look at examples, but the video will give you a good idea.
Neoclassical art emerged in the 1760s and was popular throughout Europe and North America until the 1850s. Breaking away from the emotionally charged Baroque style of previous years, neoclassical artists would look back to the classical style of art. Neoclassical art can sometimes appear cold and unemotional, but in fact, some of the most popular neoclassical themes were emotional subjects like patriotism, sacrifice, and courage. It was the style neoclassical artists employed in depicting these themes that differed dramatically from the Baroque artists of the past. Neoclassical artists shunned the sensuality and the shallow character of Rococo's style and aimed instead for the symmetry, proportion, and simplicity achieved during the Renaissance. Neoclassical style is known for its formal composition, accurate detail, and solid lines, which sometimes came at the expense of lighting and atmosphere. It's also known for its classical and mythological themes with contemporary settings and costumes. Common themes included patriotism, honor, and human rights. Archaeology was a brand new science at the time, and it sparked public interest in all things ancient. The discovery of ruins of ancient cities like Pompeii gave modern viewers the opportunity to see ancient art for themselves. Simplicity and subtle grandeur marked the art of these ancient cultures, and with its rediscovery, it quickly came back into vogue. Both artists and the public at large were captivated by the classical style of Greco-Roman art. Johann Winckelmann, the father of archaeology, considered the idealized style of ancient art, Greek in particular, a beauty more perfect than nature. Winckelmann actually appealed to artists of his time to copy ancient style, which he described as timeless and ideal. Neoclassical artists did not need to be persuaded, and even competed amongst themselves to produce the best imitations of Greco-Roman style. Both Greek and Roman styles inspired imitations throughout the neoclassical period. However, since far more examples of Roman sculpture remained, this style with the sculptors of the day. Many sculptors actually insisted that their subjects wear Roman-style clothing to capture the essence of Roman style. Despite their idealization of the Roman aesthetic, neoclassical artists depicted the flaws of their subjects as ancient Greco-Roman artists would never do. Greco-Roman artists valued ideal looks and form as opposed to realism, but neoclassical artists tended to make some allowances in that respect. One of the leading sculptors of this age, Jean-Antoine Houdon, created a statue of George Washington. Fortunately, he did not depict the president wearing a Roman toga or sporting a Greek godlike physique. The statue can be seen today in Virginia State Capitol's Rotunda. In another sculpture, called Psyche Revived by Cupid's Kiss, a well-known sculptor named Antonio Canova depicts a scene from Apuleius's Metamorphosis. The scene shown in the sculpture is the moment of Psyche's death after she disobeys Cupid's mother Venus by opening a flask. Cupid finds Psyche dead and revives her with his love. This work's classical inspiration, fine detail, and mixture of realism and idealism are characteristic of the neoclassical period. In the large-scale painting, The Oath of the Horatii, Jacques-Louis David, who is considered one of the most important artists of the neoclassical era, modeled his soldiers on the lines of the ideal Greek warrior represented in so many classical works. The focus was, once again, on the ideal human form. David was immensely impressed with the ancient art uncovered at Pompeii, and his work clearly reflected this. In literature and social tradition, the neoclassical movement can be described as an offshoot of the Age of Enlightenment, which began in the late 17th century. Philosophers and political writers like Voltaire and Rousseau spread the new philosophies of the Enlightenment regarding science, morality, government, and basic human rights. Enlightenment age thinkers wanted to stop blindly following traditions and age-old practices, and valued reason and individualism above all else. These ideas sparked revolutions around the world, and both the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution took place during this tumultuous and radical time. The neoclassical movement swept through the architectural world as well. The Arc de Triomphe, one of the most easily recognized structures in the world, is a classic example of how the Roman Empire's architecture was imitated by neoclassical architects. Typically, the neoclassical architect was likely to focus on simple geometric forms, while ensuring that buildings' proportions were of a grand scale. Modern-day examples of neoclassical architecture stretch across continents to include the White House in Washington, D.C. The neoclassical movement spread all over the world to some degree. Towards the end of the 19th century, the neoclassical school of thought coexisted with Romanticism, a new artistic style which was just beginning to emerge.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a lot of images to get the idea of what neoclassic art looks like. And we'll look at a couple of examples here. This is two works by Jacques-Louis David, The Death of Marat and The Oath of Herati. And the top one shows actually a Roman story of these three brave soldiers of Herati making an oath to their father to fight to the death. And as the video pointed out, they're just like in perfect form and very Roman style. The architecture is very Roman. The lighting, as you can tell, this could almost be, if you look at it and you weren't really knowing this was neoclassic, you might get it confused with Baroque style because it does have some of those characteristics. It has a kind of dramatic lighting and a dramatic scene, almost theatrical. So keep in mind that neoclassic is inspired. It's an extension of Baroque. And so sometimes you can get confused if you didn't really know which time period this was in. But subject matter is a big one here. So where Baroque would have been primarily about biblical themes, this one was about a Roman story. So that is one clue that it's neoclassic. And then, of course, the time period that it's in, 1784, nearing the end of the 18th century. But it is very opposing to Rococo, which is technically the movement that came right before it. It is not flowery and whimsical and silly and just lighthearted. It's pretty serious in tone. You have these women over here who are really sad because they're the wives who know that or actually maybe they're the sisters of these brothers, and one of them loves the men that they're going out to kill, as the story goes, and so she's extra sad. But as it said, some of the themes of the neoclassic art would be like patriotism, honor, and mythology, and so you see this fitting into that very much. Okay, and then the other one by David here is The Death of Marat. Has an interesting story that goes with it. This was part of the French Revolution storyline, and so we have a major figure in the revolution. Jean-Paul Marat was the fiery voice of the radical political faction called the Jacobins. Because of a painful skin ailment, he spent his days in the bathtub, which was fitted out with a writing desk so he could work. And there he received callers. A woman named Charlotte Corday, who sympathized with a rival political faction called the Guidorian, gained entry into his apartment and stabbed him to death in his bathtub. So in the textbook that I'm reading from says, in lesser hands, Marat's demise could have been laughable, a naked man murdered in his tub. But David has invested the event with all the pathos and dignity of Christ being lowered into his tomb. Can you see that similarity there, or that the same feel of that painting? Like thinking back to Caravaggio's Entombment of the Christ. Marat is shown in effect as a kind of secular Christ martyred for the revolution. All the forms are concentrated on the lower half of the composition. The light bathes the fallen leader in an unearthly glow, both of these devices contributing to the sense of the tragedy. Marat's face and body could be those of a fallen Greek warrior, sculpted in marble by an ancient master. David's purpose in this work was to transform a man who may be considered Satan himself into a sainted hero. But it is a very interesting composition with all, as it said, all the action in this lower half and this really blank space above. That makes me think of balance, using the negative space, this ground area, as we would call it from earlier chapters, mixed with this figure space. And so it's balanced, but the nothingness up here balances all the things that are happening down in the bottom of the composition. And this painting by Charles Willson Peale, George Washington at the Battle of Princeton, 1781, shows an American spin on neoclassicism. As the video said, this was not just a French or even European art movement. It spread throughout a large area and even into the Americas. This idea of patriotism, honor, is popular in the United States at this time as well. And also, as it mentioned, it has a strong philosophy of enlightenment that goes with it. Reason, individualism, people being able to stand on their own 2 feet and make something of themselves. All these ideas leading to revolution, sparking revolution. The video pointed out, and it's important to remember also with neoclassicism, very much influenced by the Greco-Roman art of the ancient world that we talked about many chapters ago, and idealized beauty and idealized people, and just making the artwork very balanced and proportional, symmetry, all those things, detail, cleanness, all those things are taken from classical art. But one big thing that was not is flaws. So if you recall, in Greek and Roman art, they made people look idealized and perfect. That was the goal. But at this time period with neoclassicism, it carried a lot of those traits, except they drew people how they actually looked. They made people look imperfect. So even though Marat looks pretty muscular in this picture, this is how he would have looked. They didn't even create his face looking as a perfect Greek sculpture. It does show his flaws. George Washington and the statue in the film showed, or in the video showed, the statue of him, just how he looked. It wasn't trying to idealize his form. It just made a realistic image of him. But I hope you also caught on to how much this style and this time period really did influence architecture, even into our White House and many of our buildings in the United States, influenced by neoclassicism. Okay, so that is it for lesson chapter 17. The next chapter we will be skipping over, if we had the textbook, we'll be skipping over a couple chapters of the Eastern world and still focusing on European art. So the next section will be chapter 21. So when that shows up, don't be confused. It just goes along with the textbook that we're using. 21 is the modern world, so we'll be going from 1800 to 1945. So it's going to be a large span that jumps into the contemporary world at the end of it. But this is it for the 18th century.